And so with that, I am going to be calling on Dr. Edwin Tambara, who is going to be giving us the very first presentation. Dr. Edwin.
Thank you very much, Israel. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. And yeah, I'm glad to be here, but first things first, I know, Israel, I'm among doctors, but I'm not a doctor myself, not yet. So again, it's a tremendous honor to be part of this initiative, to be part of this such tremendous panel. And really, I'm gonna just give my quick remarks. And I thought I would try and focus on where we are with African conservation, and then just highlight a few things that I think can tie in with the African diaspora in terms of how you can contribute to conservation in Africa as it is moving forward. So thank you very much. I think this is, just this week, this is the second in terms of a first ever gathering of Africans doing something amazing that's going to help advance conservation. We are here at the African Conservation Congress, which is again a first ever gathering of Africa to try and articulate a vision for conservation in Africa. So I'll start by saying that Africa is very young, as we all know it, dynamic and rapidly evolving continent with promising potential. And that's our context as we look at how is conservation going to advance in the next decades. And at the same time, the continent has natural systems that are being pushed to their limits due to the growing demands for food, water, and energy resources, among other things. So this is the context we find ourselves in, trying to do conservation and make sure that African wildlife and wildlands and ecosystems continue to thrive and provide the ecosystem goods and services that have supported millions of people, millions of livelihoods across the continent. And recently, as we know, with the pandemic, the pressure has certainly increased as governments are trying to fast-track development that maximizes revenues and also opportunities for economic growth. So against this backdrop, the value of our natural infrastructure has become increasingly important for Africa. And also the African voices that are standing in for conservation, for the need for us to develop in a very sustainable manner, for us to assume sustainable pathways as we develop, is also increasingly grown very, very important and very critical to ensure that as we try and build back better, we are ensuring that the ecosystems that have supported us to this stage continue to be the pillars, the fundamental pillars that support livelihoods, but also economic development. So again, I think, and that has been one of the key messages that has also come through from this Congress that we are in, that unfortunately the approach we have used in conservation to some extent is actually alienated people from nature, where we used to have people's lives and livelihoods tied to nature, and the way we would go about our daily activities was so tied to nature, and we didn't need to, pay to conserve. Now we have eroded some of those systems that used to tie us to nature. And so one of the overwhelming messages has been, can we relook at the models we have been using and see how we can put people at the center of conservation in Africa and bring back people close to nature. And as we have seen in others, research has shown that actually, when you look at indigenous peoples and local communities, in so many places, it has been shown that they are better custodians of nature, they are better stewards of nature. Biodiversity continue to thrive in some of those places. So again, that has been an overwhelming message. But as it relates to this symposium, I thought I would point out some of the levers that have been pointed out that need to change if we are to have a paradigm shift in how we do conservation on the continent. And one of those areas really was about knowledge systems that we are using to inform conservation decisions, to inform the models that we use in conservation. Actually, a term has come up about knowledge brokers, that whoever controls the knowledge controls everything. Because whoever has the knowledge about African ecosystems, African wildlife, African people, is actually able to control the approaches that are used in how we do conservation on the continent. So one of the critical levers that needs to be worked on are our knowledge systems. Again, our knowledge system that we have relied on in conservation, which is critically important, but it has come at the expense of sidelining indigenous knowledge systems. Again, what I referred to earlier in terms of how Africans have co-evolved with nature in their livelihood and other economic activities. And that indigenous knowledge has actually been sidelined. It's never been used to inform decisions, to inform approaches and conservation strategies that we are using. So together with making sure that we bring the knowledge to African constituencies, that African constituencies need to drive these knowledge products that are informing how we do conservation. There's also a need to put efforts into integrating our indigenous knowledge systems back into what is informing our conservation approaches. And so that's a critical area that I think as the African biodiversity diaspora needs to look into, how can we begin to shift some of the centers of knowledge about African natural ecosystems, about African wildlife into Africa, into local communities, and how can that knowledge, whether it's scientific, how can it be translated in a way that it can be used and localized in some of the context. But also, again, looking at, I think, where research or studies have been done about indigenous knowledge, it has been purely academic. And in many instances, that has not translated into how can that be used or integrated into conservation practice. So I think most of the experts within this forum can play a role in making sure that the knowledge is documented, is surfaced, but also can now be integrated into conservation practice and begin to inform some of the approaches that are going to be make sure that we bring people to the center and conservation is actually driven with that approach in mind. So I think that's one of the key levers that I would say needs to happen as we shift the paradigm in terms of how conservation is happening in Africa. So again, I'll mention that one of the key things for us at the African Wildlife Foundation has been to emphasize that, conservation in Africa, again, as we change this paradigm, it needs to be owned and led by Africans. Unless that happens, we are not going to be successful. Unless Africans continue to see conservation as a foreign concept because of the way we have been doing it, it's not going to be successful. So we need to see that shift happen. And what have we been doing at the African Wildlife Foundation to try and put efforts into this shift? Since our foundation in 1961 and the decades that have followed, we have worked very closely with African governments, local communities, development partners, private sector to advance conservation in Africa. But as part of our DNA, African leadership for conservation has been key, has been a common thread through the decades. And for us, we think that it remains a fundamental approach that needs to be scaled in terms of how many Africans are participating in this sector, not just in terms of careers, but also how many Africans are aware of the importance and role of conservation in Africa's development. So no matter which sector you find yourself in as an African, how can you make sure that the decisions that we are making for economic growth, for agricultural or for livelihood growth is actually feeding into conservation of our natural systems? So at the center, at the core of our DNA is the need for African leadership. And over the years, we have supported various African individuals, institutions in trying to develop leadership for conservation on the continent. And currently our vision is looking at how can conservation on the continent thrive alongside development. So with the context I have given you, the rapid changes that we are seeing in Africa, the onset of the pandemic and the impacts that we are seeing from the pandemic, the need to build back better, how can we make sure that conservation can be done alongside development? And it's not seen as a competing claim, is what has been the case for many years. How can we make sure that African leaders at all levels, from local communities to regional governments to national level governments to the continental level as well, can actually begin to see conservation, our natural systems, our wildlife as assets and key pillars that can drive Africa's economic growth. So with that, we have been working recently in investing in African platforms that are needed, bringing Africans together. And I'll give a few examples of some of those platforms that we have tried to bring together so that Africa can begin to align, work together, shape our priorities, shape a common vision, and shape the way we want to do conservation on the continent. One such platform is a grouping of African protected area directors. We have a grouping of African civil societies, again, trying to make sure that we are collectively shaping a vision that allows us to raise African voices at the global level, begin to influence how the globe partners with Africa in doing conservation. But this is a vision that is still shaping up. And this is where we see the role of African experts in the diaspora in shaping this vision, because it needs to be supported by knowledge, by research, by studies that help us shape this vision. I'll also refer to the issue I mentioned about the importance of indigenous knowledge systems. How do we best integrate these systems into this vision and this approach that we are driving now? So as we shape this vision, it is critical, and I'm glad that this symposium has also happened at this time, because it provides an opportune time for you to see what Africa is shaping and how you can participate and how you can be part of providing the thought leadership that is needed to support how Africa can advance conservation on the continent. How best can we recover wildlife populations that are critically threatened? How best can we integrate conservation and development? How best can we mitigate the impacts of climate change on our wildlife and natural ecosystems as they support people? How best can we ensure that there is adaptation measures that are coming up? How can they be informed by current research and information and evidence that is needed for decision making? So for me, I'm really glad of this convening, and I see the potential to work together in shaping this vision in how Africa is coming together and redefining how we want to do conservation on the continent. And that can only happen if we are able to come together, generate the necessary knowledge products that are needed for decision-making from all levels of leadership, from communities, national, all the way to the global level. So I'll stop on that, and glad for the opportunity and happy to share more as we discuss with the panel. Thank you.